Sometimes the most broken hearts recognize each other without saying a word. When Evan Miller saw that pregnant golden retriever stepping out of his neighbor's truck, both carrying the weight of being unwanted, something stirred deep in his chest. Harold Briggs thought he was punishing Evan by dumping the dog on his property after their fence dispute. Everyone in Cedar Ridge figured Evan would sell her off or let her fend for herself. They were wrong. Evan had plans that would change everything. But what could a struggling farmer possibly do with a pregnant dog that would shock an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn crept across the Miller family farm like a gentle hand stroking the weathered land back to consciousness. Evan had been awake for 20 minutes already, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed in the farmhouse that had sheltered 3 generations of his family. The floorboards beneath his feet knew the weight of his grandfather's boots, his father's steady stride, and now his own uncertain steps as he carried forward a legacy that felt heavier each morning. At 34, Evan Miller possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from years of working land that demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep hope alive. His hands bore the honest calluses of a man who understood that every fence post driven into rocky soil was both a small victory and a reminder of how much work lay ahead. The Miller family farm had been established in 1952, and the faded wooden sign at the end of the gravel driveway bore witness to decades of seasons that had tested the resolve of everyone who called this place home. The farmhouse itself reflected the family's practical nature, no unnecessary flourishes, just solid construction meant to withstand whatever weather the Kentucky hills might deliver. Evan's parents had added the wraparound porch in the 80s, and his mother had painted the shutters a cheerful blue that had long since faded to a softer, more weathered shade. She used to say the house grew more beautiful with age, like a good marriage or a fine wine. Evan missed her optimism almost as much as he missed her Sunday morning pancakes and the way she hummed while hanging laundry on the line that still stretched between 2 old oak trees in the backyard. The death of his parents 3 years earlier had left him with more than grief. It had left him with debts that seemed to multiply like weeds in untended soil, medical bills from his father's final illness, equipment loans that still demanded monthly payments, and the constant pressure of property taxes on land that produced just enough to keep the farm afloat, but never enough to truly prosper. Some mornings, Evan wondered if he was preserving a legacy or simply postponing the inevitable. His daily routine had become a meditation of sorts, each task performed with the deliberate care his father had taught him. Feed the 3 remaining cattle in the north pasture. Check the fence lines where Harold Briggs' property met his own. Tend to the small vegetable garden his mother had planted behind the kitchen, and assess which repairs could wait another week, and which demanded immediate attention. The barn needed new roofing before winter, and the tractor had developed a concerning rattle that spoke of expensive repairs ahead. Cedar Ridge was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, often before the person involved knew it themselves. The post office served as an unofficial information exchange, where Dolores McKinnon sorted mail and dispensed gossip with equal efficiency. The diner on Main Street was where farmers gathered over coffee to discuss weather patterns, crop prices, and who was struggling to keep their head above water. Evan rarely joined these conversations, preferring to handle his problems privately. But he knew the other farmers were watching him with the sympathetic concern reserved for a young man trying to fill boots that might be too large. Harold Briggs owned the adjacent property, 200 acres of prime farmland that his family had worked for nearly as long as the Millers had worked theirs. Harold was 15 years older than Evan, with the kind of confidence that came from never having experienced real hardship. His operation was larger, more mechanized, and significantly more profitable. He had strong opinions about how farming should be done and wasn't shy about sharing them, especially when it came to what he saw as Evan's overly sentimental approach to land management. The fence dispute had started small, as these things often do. A section of boundary fencing had fallen during a spring storm, and Harold had insisted that Evan's cattle had damaged his crops while the fence was down. Evan knew his cattle hadn't strayed. He checked them twice daily, but Harold demanded compensation for what he claimed were significant losses. When Evan politely disagreed and asked to see evidence of the damage, Harold's tone had shifted from neighborly irritation to something much colder. "You Miller boys never did understand the business side of farming," Harold had said, standing in Evan's driveway with his arms crossed and his jaw set. "Your daddy was too soft, and you're following right in his footsteps. This land deserves better management than you can give it." Evan had bitten back his response, knowing that escalating the conflict would serve no purpose. But Harold's words had stung because they carried an echo of Evan's own deepest fears. Was he truly capable of honoring his family's legacy, or was he simply a man clinging to something beyond his abilities? The other neighbors maintained a careful neutrality in the dispute between Harold and Evan. Sarah Chun, who ran the county animal shelter, lived in the small house her late husband had built on 5 acres just west of Evan's property. She was in her early 30s, with the kind of gentle competence that made both animals and people trust her instinctively. Evan had spoken with her perhaps a dozen times over the years, usually when one of his cattle had wandered near her property line, and he had always been struck by her calm intelligence and genuine warmth. Mrs. Shunno, relation to Sarah, was an elderly widow who had moved to Cedar Ridge after her husband's retirement from the railroad. She lived in a neat cottage on the outskirts of town and was known for her remarkable vegetable garden and her willingness to help anyone who needed an extra pair of hands during harvest season. She had worked alongside Evan's mother during community canning projects and had continued to check on Evan after his parents' deaths, bringing him casseroles and gentle conversation when she sensed he needed both. Young Jake Morrison was 16 and worked part-time at various farms throughout the area, saving money for a truck and dreaming of the day he could afford his own small plot of land. He was a good worker with strong shoulders and an eagerness to learn that reminded Evan of himself at that age. Jake's family had moved to Cedar Ridge when he was 12, and he had quickly become known as a reliable helper who showed up on time and worked until the job was finished. The rhythm of farm life provided a structure that Evan found both comforting and demanding. Spring meant preparing fields, repairing equipment, and planning for the year ahead. Summer brought long days of cultivation, maintenance, and the constant vigilance required to keep crops and animals healthy. Fall demanded the intense focus of harvest, when months of work either paid off or proved insufficient. Winter offered a brief respite for planning and indoor projects, but it also brought the harsh reality of expenses that continued even when income stopped flowing. Evan's father had taught him that farming was equal parts science, art, and faith. The science lay in understanding soil composition, weather patterns, and the complex relationships between plants, animals, and their environment. The art emerged in the countless daily decisions that couldn't be reduced to formulas: when to plant, when to harvest, how to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a field was thriving or struggling. The faith was perhaps the most challenging component, requiring a farmer to trust in processes larger than himself and to believe that honest work would eventually be rewarded, even when evidence suggested otherwise. The financial pressures weighing on the Miller farm were not unique to Evan's situation. Small family farms across the region faced similar challenges as agricultural economics increasingly favored large-scale operations with access to expensive technology and established distribution networks. Many of Evan's neighbors had sold their land to developers or larger farming corporations, using the proceeds to relocate to suburban areas where they could find employment that offered regular paychecks and health insurance. Benefits. Evan understood the practical arguments for selling, but he also felt a responsibility to something beyond immediate financial considerations. His grandfather had broken this soil with mules and determination, building a life from raw land and unwavering commitment. His father had modernized the operation while maintaining the core values of stewardship and respect for the natural world. Evan wanted to believe that his own chapter in the farm story would add something meaningful to that legacy, even if he wasn't yet certain what that contribution might be. The evening when Harold Briggs drove up the gravel lane with a pregnant golden retriever in the back of his truck. Evan was replacing boards on the front porch steps, a project he had been postponing for months but could no longer ignore. The sound of Harold's diesel engine was unmistakable, and Evan felt his stomach tighten as he set down his hammer and straightened to face whatever confrontation was approaching. Harold parked near the house and stepped out of his truck with the deliberate movements of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind. His expression carried a mixture of satisfaction and determination that immediately put Evan on guard. In the truck bed, Evan could see a large dog with golden fur and intelligent eyes that seemed to be assessing her surroundings with cautious interest. "Evening, Evan," Harold said, his tone carrying false friendliness. "I've got something here that belongs to you now." The pregnant golden retriever watched the exchange between the two men with the alertness of an animal who had learned to read human emotions for signs of safety or danger. Her coat was beautiful, but showed signs of neglect. Mats in her fur suggested she hadn't been properly groomed in some time, and her eyes held a wariness that spoke of uncertainty about her place in the world. Despite her obvious pregnancy, she carried herself with dignity, as if determined to maintain her composure regardless of the circumstances. "I don't understand," Evan said, though a cold certainty was already forming in his chest about Harold's intentions. "This here dog has been nothing but trouble," Harold continued, lowering the truck's tailgate. "Owner couldn't handle her anymore, and I figure since you Millers are so fond of taking in strays and lost causes, she'd be perfect for you. Consider it my contribution to your operation." The cruel humor in Harold's voice made Evan's hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm. The pregnant dog needed his attention more than his anger needed expression. As Harold coaxed the dog out of the truck bed, Evan could see that she moved carefully, protecting her swollen belly while maintaining the graceful bearing that marked her as a well-bred animal who had once known better care. "I'll call animal control in the morning," Evan said quietly, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. Harold's laugh held no warmth. "You do whatever you think is right, Evan. That's what you Millers do best, make everything more complicated than it needs to be." After Harold drove away, leaving dust hanging in the evening air like a question mark, Evan found himself alone with a pregnant dog who regarded him with hopeful uncertainty. She was beautiful, despite her bedraggled condition, with the kind of intelligent eyes that suggested she understood far more than most people gave dogs credit for understanding. Her golden coat caught the last rays of sunlight, and when she tentatively wagged her tail, Evan felt something shift in his chest. "Well, girl," he said softly, kneeling down and extending his hand for her to sniff. "I guess we're both dealing with more than we bargained for." The dog approached cautiously, a nose working to assess this new human who spoke with gentle patience rather than the harsh commands she might have expected. When she finally allowed Evan to stroke her head, her tail wagged with genuine enthusiasm for the first time since stepping out of Harold's truck. In that moment, as evening shadows lengthened across the Miller family farm and a pregnant golden retriever decided to trust a lonely farmer who understood something about carrying burdens too heavy for one individual to bear alone. Neither Evan nor the dog could have imagined how profoundly this meeting would change not only their own lives, but the entire fabric of their small community. Evan named her Maple after the tree his mother had planted the year he was born, a tree that had grown strong and provided shelter for everything that sought refuge beneath its spreading branches. 3 days after Maple's arrival, the storm hit Cedar Ridge with the kind of fury that reminded everyone how small they were in the face of nature's power. The Weather Service had predicted severe thunderstorms, but the reality proved more intense than the warnings suggested. Rain lashed against the farmhouse windows in sheets, and wind howled through the barn eaves with a sound like some ancient creature voicing its displeasure with the world. Evan had spent the afternoon securing loose equipment and checking that his few remaining cattle had access to shelter in the north pasture. Maple had followed him on these rounds, staying close but never getting in the way, as if she understood the seriousness of storm preparation. Her pregnancy was becoming more obvious each day, and Evan had begun to worry about when her puppies might arrive and whether he was equipped to help if complications arose. The worn collar around Maple's neck told a story of neglect that troubled Evan more each time he noticed it. The leather was cracked and stiff, clearly too small for her current size, and it had rubbed patches of fur thin where it pressed against her skin. That evening, as rain drummed against the kitchen windows and Maple rested near the wood stove, Evan decided he couldn't let her wear it another day. "Come here, girl," he said softly, settling onto the floor beside her. "Let's get this thing off you." Maple lifted her head, studying his face with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to his intentions. When he reached toward her neck, she didn't pull away, though he could feel tension in her muscles, the readiness of an animal who had learned to be cautious about human hands. Near vulnerable places, the collar's buckle was stiff with age and dirt, and it took Evan several minutes of patient work to loosen it enough to slip over Maple's head. When it finally came free, she immediately began scratching at the spots where it had been rubbing, relief evident in every movement. The collar itself was a sad artifact, once probably expensive, now just a reminder of better days that had ended badly for both dog and previous owner. "There," Evan said, tossing the collar into the wastebasket. "You don't need that anymore." Maple's response was immediate and heartwarming. She pressed her head against Evan's chest, tail wagging with an enthusiasm he hadn't seen since Harold had dumped her in his driveway. It was as if removing the collar had symbolically freed her from whatever unhappy circumstances had led to her abandonment, allowing her to fully accept that this place might actually become home. Around midnight, the storm reached its peak intensity. Lightning split the sky with brilliant flashes that turned the landscape stark white for brief moments before plunging it back into darkness. Thunder followed each flash with bone-deep rumbles that shook the old farmhouse and set the windows rattling in their frames. Evan lay in bed, listening to the storm's fury and thinking about the morning's farm chores, when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Maple was whimpering downstairs, but these weren't the ordinary sounds of a dog disturbed by loud weather. These were deeper, more urgent sounds that spoke of distress beyond simple fear. Evan was out of bed and down the stairs before he fully realized he was moving. Guided by an instinct he didn't entirely understand, he found Maple in the kitchen, pacing restlessly and panting heavily despite the cool air. Her sides were distended more than usual, and when she looked at him, her eyes held a desperate intensity that needed no translation. Labor had begun, and from the urgency of her movements, it was progressing quickly. "Okay, girl," Evan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "We're going to handle this together." He had witnessed animal births before cows, mainly, and a few horses during his childhood when the farm had been larger and more diverse. But dogs were different, and Maple was not just any dog. She had become important to him in ways he was still discovering, and the thought of losing her or her puppies to complications he couldn't handle made his chest tight with anxiety. The logical choice was the barn, where there was more space and fewer expensive household items that could be damaged. Evan grabbed an armload of old blankets and towels from the linen closet, then gently encouraged Maple to follow him outside. The rain had lessened slightly, but the wind was still strong enough to drive moisture under the barn's overhanging roof. Inside the barn, Evan quickly prepared a makeshift birthing area in an empty stall that was clean and relatively draft-free. He spread the blankets in layers, creating a soft nest that would provide warmth and comfort for Maple and her soon-to-arrive puppies. A single bare bulb provided adequate light, casting everything in warm yellow tones that made the scene feel both intimate and timeless. Maple seemed to approve of the arrangements. She circled the blanket nest several times before settling down with a deep sigh that suggested relief at finding a suitable place for the monumental task ahead. Evan positioned himself nearby, close enough to help if needed, but far enough away to avoid interfering with natural processes that had been working successfully for thousands of years. The first puppy arrived just after 1 a.m, emerging into the world with the wet, urgent gasping that announced new life. Maple immediately began the instinctive process of cleaning her offspring, her rough tongue stimulating breathing and circulation while removing the birth sac. The puppy was tiny and dark, with the wrinkled features that made all newborns look simultaneously ancient and impossibly young. "Good girl, Maple," Evan whispered, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. "You're doing beautifully." The second puppy followed 20 minutes later, and then a third 30 minutes after that. Each arrival was a small miracle that left Evan feeling privileged to witness something so fundamental and profound. Maple worked with focused intensity, caring for each puppy with the kind of competence that spoke to deep biological wisdom. Her earlier anxiety had transformed into calm purposefulness, as if labor had connected her to some ancient knowledge about what needed to be done. By 3 a.m, 5 puppies lay nestled against Maple's warm flank, their tiny bodies squirming with the blind determination of creatures seeking milk and security. They were beautiful in the way that all healthy newborns are beautiful, perfect in their completeness, unmarked by the world's complications, full of potential that could unfold in countless directions. Evan sat in the straw watching this new family, feeling something profound settling into place in his chest. The storm outside continued its assault on the Kentucky hills, but inside the barn, peace reigned in the warm circle of light where Maple tended her babies with patient devotion. This was life asserting itself against all odds, beauty emerging from circumstances that had begun with cruelty and abandonment. The practical implications of 5 puppies were staggering. Evan barely had enough money to feed himself and maintain the farm's basic operations. Veterinary bills, puppy food, vaccinations, and the dozen other expenses that came with responsible pet ownership would strain his already tight budget beyond the breaking point. The logical decision would be to contact animal control in the morning, explain the situation, and let professionals handle the placement of the puppies with families who could afford proper care. But as Evan watched Maple nuzzle her babies and listened to their contented squeaking, he knew that logic would not be governing his decisions where this family was concerned. Something had shifted inside him during the hours of labor, some recognition of responsibility that went beyond financial considerations. These 5 puppies had been born on his property, under his watch, with his help. That created a bond that transcended practical concerns. "We'll figure it out," he whispered to Maple, who looked up at him with tired but satisfied eyes. "Somehow we'll make this work." As dawn approached and the storm finally began to weaken, Evan found himself thinking about his parents and what they would have done in this situation. His mother would have immediately begun planning for the puppy's care, making lists and organizing resources with the efficient optimism that had characterized her approach to all of life's challenges. His father would have quietly started building proper housing and researching the best practices for raising healthy puppies, because he believed that if you were going to do something, you should do it right. Neither of them would have turned away from 5 helpless creatures who needed care, regardless of the inconvenience or expense. The Miller family farm had always been a place where life was nurtured and protected, where the strong cared for the vulnerable. Evan realized that continuing that tradition might be the most important way he could honor his parents' memory and justify his stewardship of their legacy. The storm had brought more than rain and wind to the Miller farm. It had brought a test of character that would define everything that followed. As Evan sat in the barn watching Maple and her 5 perfect puppies sleep peacefully in the soft yellow light, he felt the first stirrings of a vision that would ultimately transform not only his own life, but the entire community of Cedar Ridge. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but it no longer sounded like nature's fury. It sounded like blessing. The morning after the storm brought crystalline air and the kind of light that made everything look newly created. Evan woke in the barn where he had dozed fitfully in a chair beside Maple and her puppies, his neck stiff and his clothes wrinkled, but his heart lighter than it had been in months. The new family was thriving, 5 tiny bodies pressed against their mother's warmth, occasionally squeaking with the urgent hunger of creatures whose entire universe consisted of milk, sleep, and the security of being close to the one who would protect them. Maple looked up when Evan stirred, her tail offering a tentative wag that seemed to ask whether he approved of her night's work. Her eyes held a new confidence, the quiet pride of a mother who had successfully brought new life into the world despite uncertain circumstances. She had claimed this corner of the barn as her own, and her body language suggested she had no intention of being moved from the nest Evan had helped her create. "You did good, Mama," Evan said softly, reaching out to stroke her head. "Better and good. You did something beautiful." The practical demands of the morning couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Evan's cattle needed attention, storm damage required assessment, and the regular rhythms of farm life demanded their due. But as he prepared to leave the barn for his usual rounds, he felt reluctant to abandon this peaceful scene. Something important had happened here during the night, something that went beyond the biological fact of birth to touch deeper questions about purpose and responsibility. In the house, Evan made coffee and scrambled eggs while his mind worked through the immediate challenges facing Maple's family. The puppies would need veterinary attention within the next few days' health checks, vaccinations, and professional assessment of their development. Maple herself should be examined to ensure she had recovered properly from labor and was equipped to nurse 5 demanding babies. The costs would be significant, but they were non-negotiable if Evan intended to do right by this family he had inherited. After breakfast, he walked to the old workshop behind the house where his father's tools waited in the organized silence of a craftsman's domain. The workshop smelled of sawdust and machine oil, familiar scents that brought back memories of childhood afternoons spent watching his father transform raw lumber into useful objects. Every tool had its designated place, and even 3 years after his father's death, Evan maintained the same careful organization that had been instilled in him from an early age. The toolbox itself was a work of art, solid oak construction with brass fittings built by Evan's grandfather and passed down through the family like a sacred trust. Inside, chisels lay in felt-lined compartments beside hand planes that had been sharpened so many times. Their steel had developed a patina of long use. These were tools that had built barns and houses, crafted furniture and toys, repaired equipment, and created beauty from materials that lesser hands might have wasted. Evan selected a measuring tape, pencil, and notepad, then returned to the barn to assess what modifications would be needed to create proper accommodations for Maple and her growing family. The current arrangement was adequate for the immediate emergency, but 5 puppies would soon outgrow their blanket nest and require more sophisticated housing that could be cleaned easily and provided protection from weather and potential predators. The empty stall where Maple had given birth was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with solid wooden walls on 3 sides and steel mesh fencing on the 4th. The concrete floor would need covering with materials that provided warmth and traction for developing puppies while remaining easy to sanitize. Proper drainage would be essential, as would adequate ventilation that didn't create drafts. Most importantly, the space needed to accommodate a mother dog and 5 increasingly active puppies without feeling cramped or stressful. As Evan measured and sketched, his mind began working through design possibilities with the methodical approach his father had taught him. The best solutions were usually the simplest ones, built from readily available materials using proven techniques that could be modified to meet specific needs. This wasn't about creating something fancy. It was about creating something functional that would serve its intended purpose for months to come. His planning was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching the house. Through the barn's open door, Evan could see a white pickup truck with official markings pulling into his driveway. His heart sank as he recognized the logo of the county animal control office. Though he tried to tell himself that this visit might be coincidental rather than related to Harold's actions 3 days earlier. Sarah Chung climbed out of the truck with the calm efficiency that characterized all her movements. She was dressed in khaki work clothes and sturdy boots, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it out of her way while she worked. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Evan thought he detected a hint of genuine concern in her dark eyes as she walked toward the barn. "Morning, Evan," she said, a voice carrying the careful tone of someone who wasn't certain what kind of reception to expect. "I heard you might have acquired a dog recently, and I wanted to check on the situation." "Harold called you," Evan said, the words coming out flatter than he had intended. "Harold mentioned that he had brought you a pregnant stray," Sarah confirmed. "He thought you might need assistance with placement or medical care. I brought some supplies just in case." Sarah's truck bed contained a collection of items that spoke to her preparedness for various animal-related emergencies. Kennels of different sizes, bags of dog food, blankets, medical supplies, and cleaning materials. She approached the barn with the unhurried pace of someone who understood that sudden movements could spook animals in unfamiliar situations. "They're in here," Evan said, leading her toward the stall where Maple was nursing her puppies. Sarah's reaction to the scene was everything Evan could have hoped for. Her professional composure softened into genuine admiration as she took in the sight of Maple contentedly caring for 5 healthy puppies in the clean, well-organized nest Evan had created. She knelt at a respectful distance, allowing Maple to assess her presence without feeling threatened. "Oh my," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying the kind of reverence that people reserve for witnessing something truly beautiful. "Look at that mama. She's doing such a good job." Maple seemed to sense Sarah's approval and expertise. After a few moments of careful observation, she relaxed enough to allow Sarah to move closer for a better look at the puppies. Sarah's examination was thorough but gentle, her hands moving with the confident touch of someone who had handled countless animals throughout her career. 5 healthy puppies, she announced after several minutes of assessment. "Good size, good coloring, breathing. Well, nursing successfully. Mama looks tired but alert and protective. This is exactly how you want to see a new family 3 days after birth." Relief flooded through Evan so powerfully that he had to lean against the stall wall for support. He hadn't realized how worried he had been about whether he was providing adequate care until Sarah's professional approval reassured him that his instincts had been sound. "I've never dealt with newborn puppies before," he admitted. "I wasn't sure if I was doing things right." "You're doing everything right," Sarah said firmly. "The mother is calm and comfortable. The puppies are thriving, and you've created a clean, safe environment for them. That's exactly what they need at this stage." Sarah stood and brushed straw from her knees. then fixed Evan with a direct look that suggested she had more to say. The question now is what happens next. 5 puppies represent a significant commitment in terms of time, money, and energy. Have you thought about your long-term plans for this family? The question hung in the air between them like a bridge. Evan hadn't decided whether to cross. He could tell Sarah about his financial constraints, explain that he was barely keeping the farm afloat, and ask for her help in finding homes for puppies he couldn't afford to keep. That would be the sensible approach, the one that acknowledged practical limitations and prioritized realistic outcomes. Instead, he found himself talking about his father's workshop and the tools that had been waiting for a worthy project. He described his vision for converting the stall into proper accommodations that could house Maple and her family comfortably while they grew and developed. He talked about his desire to ensure that each puppy found a truly good home rather than simply any available home, and his growing sense that this responsibility had arrived in his life for reasons he didn't yet fully understand. Sarah listened with the focused attention of someone who heard hundreds of stories about animals and their human caretakers, but recognized when one carried special significance. When Evan finished speaking, she was quiet for a moment, studying Maple and her puppies with the contemplative expression of someone weighing multiple considerations. "You know," she said finally, "I've been running the county shelter for 8 years, and I've seen every possible outcome for situations like this. The best results always happen when someone genuinely cares about the animal's welfare, rather than just viewing them as problems to be solved quickly." She paused, watching one of the puppies squirm closer to Maple's warmth before continuing. "We're overwhelmed at the shelter right now. Spring always brings a surge of abandoned animals, and our adoption rates haven't kept pace with intakes. If you're serious about providing good care for this family, I'd rather support that than add 5 more animals to an already strained system." The offer of partnership implied more than Sarah had explicitly stated. Evan could see in her expression that she was assessing not just his current situation, but his potential for becoming someone who could make a meaningful difference in the ongoing challenge of animal welfare in their rural community. It was an assessment that would prove prophetic in ways neither of them could have imagined as they stood in the warm morning light, streaming through the barn's open doors. Sarah's business card was simple white cardstock with black lettering, but as Evan held it later that afternoon, it felt like it carried more weight than such a small piece of paper should reasonably bear. Cedar Ridge County Animal Shelter was printed in modest font above Sarah's name and contact information, along with a small logo featuring a silhouette of a dog and cat sitting side by side. Below that, in smaller text, was a mission statement that read, "Providing compassionate care and finding loving homes for animals in need." The card represented a bridge between Evan's growing attachment to Maple and her puppies and the larger world of animal welfare that he was only beginning to understand. Sarah had left it with him along with a starter supply of high-quality puppy food, detailed care instructions, and a promise to return the following week to check on the family's progress. More importantly, she had left him with the sense that he was not alone in his commitment to doing right by these animals. During the 3 days since the puppy's birth, Evan had found himself spending increasing amounts of time in the barn, ostensibly checking on Maple's family, but actually marveling at the small daily miracles of development and growth. The puppies had already begun to show distinct personalities. One was notably larger and more assertive about claiming the best nursing positions, while another was smaller but remarkably determined, often squirming his way past bigger siblings through sheer persistence. Their eyes were still closed, but their ears were beginning to develop the characteristic shape that would eventually allow them to hear their mother's voice and respond to human commands. Maple herself had settled into motherhood with remarkable grace. She rarely left her puppies for more than a few minutes at a time, and then only to eat, drink, or tend to basic bodily needs before hurrying back to resume her vigilant care. Her earlier wariness had been replaced by quiet confidence, as if successfully bringing 5 healthy puppies into the world had restored her faith in her own capabilities and worth. The bond between Evan and Maple had deepened during these intimate days of shared responsibility. She had begun to greet his arrival in the barn with tail wags and soft vocalizations that seemed designed to update him on her family's status. When one of the puppies strayed too far from the nest during sleep, she would carefully carry it back to safety, often glancing at Evan as if seeking his approval for her maternal decisions. It was becoming clear that she viewed him as a partner in the enterprise of raising her children rather than simply a provider of food and shelter. The first rescue animal arrived on a Thursday morning when Evan was installing better lighting. In Maple's stall, he heard Sarah's truck in the driveway and emerged from the barn to find her lifting a medium-sized kennel from the vehicle's bed. Inside the kennel, a black and tan mixed-breed dog sat with the resigned patience of an animal who had learned that human plans rarely aligned with canine preferences. "This is Rex," Sarah said as Evan approached. "He's about 3 years old, house-trained, good with other dogs, and desperately needs a temporary home while we work on finding him a permanent placement. His owner died last week, and the family can't keep him." Rex was a handsome dog with intelligent eyes and the kind of sturdy build that suggested working dog ancestry. His coat was well-maintained and his demeanor calm, indicating that he had been loved and properly cared for until circumstances beyond his control had disrupted his life. When Sarah opened the kennel door, he stepped out with dignity intact, but uncertainty evident in the way he surveyed his new surroundings. "I don't know anything about fostering animals," Evan said, though even as he spoke, he was kneeling down to offer his hand for Rex to sniff. "You know more than you think," Sarah replied. "Look at how well Maple and her puppies are doing. Rex just needs a safe place to stay and someone who will treat him with kindness while we find his forever home." Rex's response to Evan was immediate and positive. After a cautious sniff, he leaned into Evan's touch with the grateful acceptance of a dog who recognized genuine affection. His tail began a tentative wag that grew more enthusiastic as Evan scratched behind his ears and spoke to him in the same gentle tone he used with Maple. The introduction between Rex and Maple went more smoothly than anyone had expected. Maple emerged from her stall to investigate the newcomer, her body language alert but not aggressive. Rex, for his part, seemed to understand that he was in the presence of a nursing mother and maintained a respectful distance while clearly communicating his peaceful intentions. After several minutes of careful mutual assessment, both dogs seemed to reach an agreement that they could coexist comfortably in the same space. "Rex can use the empty stall next to Maple's," Evan found himself saying. "I'll set up a comfortable area for him and make sure he has everything he needs." Sarah's smile suggested that this outcome had been her hope all along. "I brought food and bedding for him, plus his medical records and information about his preferences. He's a good dog who just needs some time to adjust to his new situation." Over the following days, Evan discovered that caring for 2 dogs was not significantly more difficult than caring for one, especially when both animals were as well behaved as Maple and Rex. Rex quickly established his own routine within the barn's peaceful atmosphere, spending his days exploring the property under Evan's supervision and his evenings resting quietly in his stall while Maple tended to her puppies nearby. The 2 dogs seemed to take comfort in each other's presence, as if understanding that they were both refugees from difficult circumstances who had found sanctuary in the same safe harbor. The barn was becoming something more than a simple farm building, with proper lighting, clean bedding, and the presence of animals who were clearly thriving under his care. It was transforming into a space that felt purposeful and alive in ways that the empty stalls had never achieved. Evan found himself looking forward to his visits there, not just to check on Maple and Rex, but to experience the peaceful satisfaction that came from providing exactly what these animals needed to flourish. Mrs. Chun was the first community member to notice the changes at the Miller farm. She arrived one afternoon with a casserole dish and the stated intention of checking on Evan's welfare. But her true interest became apparent when she heard Rex barking a friendly greeting from the barn. "You've got dogs now," she observed with the directness that characterized her approach to most subjects. "Just temporarily," Evan said, though the words felt less true each time he spoke them. Mrs. Chun was 78 years old, with white hair that she kept in a neat bun and the kind of sharp intelligence that had made her an effective advocate for various community causes throughout her long residence in Cedar Ridge. She had raised 5 children and helped her late husband run a successful small business, experiences that had taught her to recognize potential when she saw it. "May I meet them?" she asked, and something in her tone suggested that this was more than casual curiosity. In the barn, Mrs. Chun's reaction to Maple and her puppies was immediate and heartfelt. She knelt beside the stall with remarkable agility for her age, speaking to Maple in the soothing tones that experienced animal lovers instinctively employ. Maple responded by bringing one of her puppies closer to the stall door, as if offering it for Mrs. Chun's inspection and approval. "Beautiful babies," Mrs. Chun murmured, her eyes bright with genuine pleasure. "And such a good mother. You can tell she feels safe here." Rex received equally enthusiastic attention, demonstrating his excellent manners by sitting politely while Mrs. Chen examined his coat and praised his calm demeanor. She asked detailed questions about both animals' care routines, their medical needs, and Evan's plans for their future, listening to his answers with the focused attention of someone gathering information for purposes not yet revealed. "You know," she said as they walked back toward the house, "my late husband always said that you could judge a person's character by how they treated animals who couldn't do anything for them in return. These dogs are lucky to have found you." Young Jake Morrison's introduction to the barn sanctuary happened by accident. He had come to help Evan repair fence damage from the recent storm and heard Rex barking while they worked in a nearby pasture. His curiosity led him to investigate, and his discovery of Maple's family produced the kind of immediate enchantment that puppies tend to inspire in teenage boys. "Mr. Miller, these are the most beautiful puppies I've ever seen," Jake said, his usual reserve melting away in the face of 5 tiny creatures who were just beginning to open their eyes and explore their world with wobbling steps. Jake was a serious young man who had been working part-time jobs since he was 14, saving every dollar toward his dream of someday owning his own small farm. His family had moved to Cedar Ridge from the city, and Jake had quickly fallen in love with rural life and the satisfaction that came from working with his hands to produce something tangible and useful. He was known throughout the community as reliable, hardworking, and mature beyond his years. "Would you like to help me clean their stall?" Evan asked, recognizing the genuine interest in Jake's expression. What followed was a crash course in animal care that revealed Jake's natural aptitude for working with animals. He moved quietly and calmly around Maple and her puppies, following Evan's instructions precisely while asking thoughtful questions about nutrition, development, and health care. Rex seemed to approve of the young man immediately, following him around the barn and offering his head for scratching whenever Jake paused in his work. "I could come by after school sometimes," Jake offered as they finished cleaning. "You know, to help with feeding and cleaning and stuff. I wouldn't want any money for it. I'd just like to learn about taking care of animals." The offer represented more than simple assistance with daily chores. Jake's enthusiasm and natural skill suggested that he could become a valuable partner in the growing enterprise that the barn was becoming. More importantly, his genuine affection for the animals and serious approach to their care indicated that he understood the responsibility involved in ensuring their welfare. As Evan accepted Jake's offer of help, he realized that what had begun as a reluctant response to Harold's vindictive gesture, was evolving into something much larger and more meaningful. The simple act of caring for Maple and her puppies was creating connections with other people who shared his emerging commitment to animal welfare. Sarah's professional expertise, Mrs. Chen's experienced wisdom, and Jake's youthful energy were combining with his own resources to create a network of support that none of them had planned but all of them recognized as valuable. The barn that had once housed only memories and unused equipment was becoming the heart of an operation that could make a real difference in the lives of animals who needed second chances. As Evan watched Jake gently stroke one of Maple's puppies, while Rex dozed contentedly in a patch of afternoon sunlight, he began to envision possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate needs of the animals currently in his care. The business card in his pocket seemed to pulse with potential, representing not just Sarah's contact information, but a doorway to a future he was only beginning to imagine. The stack of overdue bills on Evan's kitchen table had grown taller over the past 2 weeks, each envelope a reminder of the financial tightrope he walked every day. The electric bill carried a second notice warning of service disconnection if payment wasn't received within 10 days. The feed store invoice showed a balance that had doubled since he had started purchasing high-quality dog food and supplies for Maple, Rex, and a growing number of animals that Sarah had begun bringing to the farm. Evan sat at the same wooden table where his father had once balanced the farm's books, using the same simple ledger system that had served the Miller family for decades. The numbers told a story that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. His expenses were outpacing his income by a margin that made long-term sustainability impossible without significant changes to either his revenue streams or his approach to animal care. The farm's primary income sources remained frustratingly modest. His small cattle operation generated just enough profit to cover basic feed and veterinary costs, with little left over for equipment maintenance or debt service. The vegetable garden his mother had established provided food for his own table, and small surplus amounts that he sold at the local farmers market. But the income from produce sales was seasonal and unpredictable. A few acres of hay provided winter feed for his cattle and modest sales to neighboring farms. But hay prices fluctuated with weather conditions and market demand in ways that made financial planning challenging. Against these limited income sources, Evan now faced expenses that his parents had never contemplated. Quality dog food cost significantly more than the generic brands he might have chosen if his only concern had been keeping animals fed, rather than ensuring optimal nutrition for growing puppies and stressed rescue animals. Veterinary bills were mounting as Sarah brought him animals that required medical attention before they could be safely placed in adoptive homes. Cleaning supplies, bedding materials, and equipment modifications to accommodate different types of animals created ongoing costs that hadn't existed when the barn housed only farm equipment and stored hay. Most challenging of all was the time factor. Caring for multiple animals with different needs and schedules was proving to be nearly a full-time job in itself, leaving Evan with fewer hours available for the farm work that generated his primary income. The morning and evening feeding routines alone required 2 hours daily, and that didn't account for cleaning, exercise, medical care, and the individual attention that each animal needed to thrive in what was essentially a temporary living situation. 3 new animals had arrived over the past week, each with its own story of abandonment or owner surrender that tugged at Evan's heart, even as it strained his resources. Luna was a senior beagle whose elderly owner had moved to an assisted living facility that didn't allow pets. She was overweight and arthritic, requiring special food and medication that cost more than feeding 3 healthy young dogs. Her gentle disposition and obvious grief at being separated from the only family she had ever known made her care feel like a sacred trust rather than a simple fostering arrangement. Buddy was a 2-year-old Labrador mix whose family had surrendered. him after their landlord discovered his presence in their rental apartment. He was energetic and intelligent but completely untrained, having spent most of his life confined to a small yard with minimal human interaction. Teaching him basic manners and house training required constant supervision and infinite patience, both of which Evan was discovering he possessed in greater quantities than he had realized. The third newcomer was a pregnant cat named Whiskers, who had been found living under a mobile home after her owners moved away and left her behind. Sarah had brought her to the farm because the shelter was already overcrowded with cats, and Whiskers' advanced pregnancy meant she needed quiet, stress-free accommodations that the busy shelter environment couldn't provide. Evan had converted a corner of the feed room into a comfortable space for her, but caring for a pregnant cat required different knowledge and skills than he had developed with dogs. Jake Morrison had become an invaluable assistant, arriving at the farm each afternoon after school and working until sunset without ever asking for compensation. His enthusiasm for animal care was matched by a natural competence that impressed both Evan and Sarah during her weekly visits. Jake had quickly learned to recognize signs of illness or distress in the animals, and his gentle touch and calm demeanor seemed to reassure even the most anxious rescue animals. "I'd been thinking about what I want to do after high school," Jake said one afternoon as they cleaned kennels together. "Maybe I could study veterinary science or animal husbandry. Working here has made me realize how much I enjoy helping animals." The young man's growing passion for animal welfare was evident in everything he did around the farm. He had begun arriving early to help with morning feedings, and he often stayed late to provide extra attention to animals who seemed lonely or stressed. His questions about animal behavior, nutrition, and medical care demonstrated genuine intellectual curiosity rather than mere politeness. And Evan found himself learning alongside Jake as they both researched best practices for various aspects of animal care. Mrs. Chun had become another regular presence at the farm, arriving several times each week with homemade treats for both the animals and the humans caring for them. Her declared purpose was usually to help with laundry or cleaning, but her real contribution was the wisdom that came from decades of experience managing complex households and caring for multiple dependents simultaneously. "You need a system," she told Evan one morning as they watched him struggle to keep track of feeding schedules for 6 animals with different dietary requirements. "When I had 5 children under the age of 10, I learned that good intentions weren't enough. You need organization and routine that everyone can follow consistently." Her suggested improvements to the daily care routines were simple but transformative. Color-coded feeding charts eliminated confusion about which animals received which foods and medications. Designated storage areas for different types of supplies made it easier to maintain adequate inventories and identify when supplies needed replenishing. Standardized cleaning schedules ensured that each animal's living space received appropriate attention without overwhelming the caretakers with excessive work. Most importantly, Mrs. Chun helped Evan understand that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness or failure. It was a recognition that important work required more resources than any individual could provide alone. Her own experiences raising children and supporting community organizations had taught her that sustainable systems depended on shared responsibility and clear communication among everyone involved. Sarah's weekly visits had evolved into collaborative planning sessions where she and Evan discussed not only the current animals' needs, but also the broader challenges facing animal welfare in their rural county. The shelter was consistently operating above capacity, with adoption rates that couldn't keep pace with the steady stream of abandoned, surrendered, and stray animals requiring care. "We're seeing more owner surrenders than ever before," Sarah explained during one of these conversations. "People are facing financial hardships that make pet ownership difficult, and many don't understand the long-term commitment involved when they acquire animals. The result is a system that's overwhelmed with animals who aren't necessarily difficult to place. They just need temporary care while we find appropriate homes. The foster network that Sarah had been trying to develop consisted primarily of families who could provide short-term care for one or two animals at a time. Evan's farm was unusual in its capacity to house multiple animals simultaneously, while providing the space and individual attention that many rescue animals needed to overcome behavioral or medical issues that made them less attractive to potential adopters. "What you're doing here is making a real difference," Sarah continued. "Luna's arthritis is improving with proper diet and exercise. Buddy is learning basic obedience that will make him much more adoptable. Rex has gained confidence and social skills that he'll need in his permanent home. These animals are leaving here in better condition than when they arrived, which dramatically improves their chances of successful permanent placements." The validation was meaningful, but it didn't address the fundamental financial sustainability issues that kept Evan awake at night. Each animal he helped represented a success story, but each success story also represented expenses that brought him closer to the point where he might have to choose between continuing his animal welfare work and keeping the farm operational. As he sat at his father's old table reviewing the month's expenses, Evan realized that he was approaching a decision point that would define not only his own future, but also his ability to continue providing sanctuary for animals who had nowhere else to turn. The numbers on the page were clear, but the solution to his financial challenges remained frustratingly elusive. Something would have to change, and soon, if he wanted to maintain both his family's farming legacy and his growing commitment to animal rescue. The real estate brochure arrived in Evan's mailbox on a Tuesday morning, its glossy cover featuring aerial photographs of pristine farmland under a brilliant blue sky. Premier agricultural development opportunities in Cedar Ridge County was printed in elegant script across the top, above images that showed rolling fields transformed into upscale residential subdivisions with names like Meadowbrook Estates and Heritage Hills. Evan almost threw the brochure away without opening it, assuming it was another piece of unsolicited marketing material. But something about the specific targeting of agricultural properties in his area made him pause and examine it more carefully. Inside, he found detailed information about land values, development potential, and the contact information for Westfield Development Corporation, a company that specialized in converting rural properties into suburban residential communities. The financial figures were staggering. According to the brochure, prime agricultural land in Cedar Ridge County was selling for 3 to 4 times the per acre prices that farmers typically received for agricultural use. The Miller Farm's most valuable acreage, the 40-acre South field that bordered the main county road and had the best soil composition, could potentially generate enough income to pay off all of Evan's debts and provide substantial capital for expanding his animal rescue operations. The moral complexity of the situation settled over Evan like a weight he couldn't shake. His family had farmed this land for 3 generations, viewing themselves as stewards of soil that had been entrusted to their care. His grandfather had spoken reverently about the responsibility of maintaining agricultural productivity for future generations, and his father had refused multiple offers from developers who wanted to convert Miller land into commercial or residential use. But Evan's circumstances were different from those his father and grandfather had faced. They had been trying to preserve a farming operation that provided their primary livelihood and supported their family's economic security. Evan was struggling to maintain a farming operation that barely covered its own costs, while simultaneously developing an animal rescue mission that served a genuine community need but generated no income whatsoever. The Southfield represented more than just valuable real estate. It was some of the most productive soil on the entire farm, capable of supporting crops that could provide steady income for decades to come. Selling it would mean permanently reducing the farm's agricultural capacity and altering the fundamental character of a property that had been carefully maintained as a working farm since 1952. Yet the alternative might be losing everything. If Evan couldn't find a way to balance his expanding animal rescue work with sustainable farm economics, he might eventually be forced to sell the entire property rather than just a portion of it. The irony wasn't lost on him that his efforts to save animals might ultimately result in losing the land that made those efforts possible. For 3 days, Evan carried the brochure in his jacket pocket without mentioning it to anyone. He found himself studying the Southfield with new eyes during his daily farm rounds, trying to imagine how it would look divided into half-acre lots with suburban houses and manicured lawns. The image felt like a betrayal of everything his family had worked to preserve, but it also represented a potential solution to problems that were becoming increasingly urgent. The decision to contact Westfield Development came after a particularly difficult morning when Luna's arthritis flared up, badly enough to require an emergency veterinary visit that cost more than Evan's monthly grocery budget. As he drove home from the veterinarian's office with Luna resting uncomfortably in the passenger's seat, he realized that his current financial situation was unsustainable for the animals as well as for himself. They deserved better care than he could afford to provide, and his inability to generate adequate income was becoming a limiting factor in his ability to help them. That evening, after ensuring that all the animals were fed and comfortable, Evan sat at his kitchen table and dialed the phone number printed on the back of the development brochure. His conversation with Robert Westfield, the company's senior acquisition specialist, was brief and professional. Westfield was interested in the Southfield, willing to pay the premium prices advertised in the brochure, and able to close the transaction within 60 days if Evan decided to proceed. "Agricultural conversions are our specialty," Westfield explained. "We understand the emotional complexity of these decisions for farming families, and we work hard to make the process as smooth as possible. The key is identifying portions of your property that have the highest development value while preserving the core agricultural operation that defines your family's legacy." The conversation was encouraging in ways that Evan hadn't expected. Westfield seemed to understand that selling land wasn't simply a financial transaction for farming families. It was a decision that carried emotional and cultural weight that needed to be acknowledged and respected. The company's approach emphasized preserving the essential character of working farms, while allowing families to realize some of the economic value that development pressure had created in their properties. Over the following week, Evan found himself researching Westfield Development's track record and speaking confidentially with other farmers who had sold portions of their properties for residential development. The experiences were generally positive, with most farmers reporting that the transactions had provided financial stability that allowed them to continue farming the remaining portions of their land without the constant pressure of debt and economic uncertainty. But Evan kept his research private, unwilling to discuss his considerations with Sarah, Jake, Mrs. Chun, or anyone else in the community until he had reached a firm decision about whether to proceed. The animal rescue work had become important to too many people for him to raise hopes or concerns prematurely, and he wanted to be certain about his chosen course before opening the question to community input. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. The same financial pressures that made land development attractive were directly related to his commitment to animal rescue work that the community increasingly valued and supported. If he sold the Southfield to fund his animal rescue operations, he would be sacrificing part of his family's agricultural legacy to support a mission that had evolved from his desire to honor his parents' values of compassion and stewardship. The solution felt both pragmatic and profoundly conflicted. 40 acres of farmland would become suburban housing, but the income from that sale would allow Evan to provide better care for dozens of animals each year while maintaining the core farming operation on the remaining land. It was a compromise that acknowledged the realities of rural economics while preserving the essential elements of both his family's legacy and his emerging mission. As Evan walked through the Southfield one evening, trying to reconcile his competing loyalties to land and animals, he reflected on the complexity of stewardship in a world where good intentions weren't always sufficient to sustain worthy goals. His father had taught him that responsible leadership sometimes required difficult decisions that served long-term purposes rather than short-term preferences. Perhaps selling the Southfield represented exactly that kind of difficult but responsible decision. The development brochure had become more than marketing material. It had become a potential bridge between financial necessity and moral purpose. Whether that bridge would lead to betrayal or liberation remained to be determined, but Evan was increasingly convinced that standing still was no longer a viable option. The animals in his care deserved better than uncertainty, and the mission he had undertaken deserved more sustainable support than his current financial situation could provide. The glossy photographs of suburban subdivisions might represent the end of 40 acres of agricultural production, but they might also represent the beginning of a more robust and permanent commitment to animal welfare that could serve the community for decades to come. The choice was becoming clear, even if the emotional reconciliation with that choice remained challenging. The land survey map spread across Evan's kitchen table looked like a medical diagram of something vital being dissected. Every property, line, elevation marker, and soil classification was documented in precise detail, with the 40 acres Southfield highlighted in yellow to indicate the portion being considered for sale. Red boundaries marked setback requirements. Green shading showed areas with development restrictions, and blue lines traced water features that would influence subdivision design. Robert Westfield had delivered the survey personally, along with preliminary architectural renderings that showed how Miller's Ridge subdivision would look once construction was completed. 28 homes on half-acre lots, with a central park area that would preserve some of the field's mature oak trees. Curved streets designed to minimize traffic impact on the main county road. Underground utilities and detention ponds that would manage stormwater runoff responsibly. We've designed this development to complement the rural character of the area, rather than overwhelming it, Westfield explained as he guided Evan through the various documents. The homes will be positioned to preserve sightlines from your remaining property, and we've included buffer zones that will maintain privacy for your continuing agricultural operations. The financial terms were even more attractive than the initial estimates had suggested. Westfield Development was offering $12,000 per acre for the Southfield, nearly 4 times what the land was worth for agricultural use. A total payment of $480,000 would eliminate all of Evan's existing debts and provide substantial capital for expanding his animal rescue facilities while modernizing the farm's infrastructure. The contract included provisions that addressed many of Evan's concerns about maintaining the farm's operational integrity. Construction traffic would use temporary access roads that bypass the main farm areas. Utility installations would avoid disrupting irrigation systems or existing agricultural infrastructure. Most importantly, restrictive covenants would prevent future homeowners from filing nuisance complaints against normal farming activities, like early morning equipment use or seasonal odors associated with livestock operations. Evan had been meeting with Westfield for 2 weeks, always at times when Sarah, Jake, and Mrs. Chun weren't likely to be at the farm. He told himself that discretion was necessary until he made a final decision. But the secrecy felt increasingly uncomfortable as his commitment to the land sale solidified. These were people who had invested time and emotional energy in supporting his animal rescue work, and they deserved to understand the financial realities that were driving his decisions. The morning when everything changed began like any other. Evan completed the usual feeding routines, checked on Maple's puppies, who were now 5 weeks old and beginning to explore beyond their nest, and spend time exercising the adult dogs who needed daily activity to maintain their physical and mental health. Jake arrived after school and immediately noticed that Evan seemed distracted and less talkative than usual. "Is everything okay, Mr. Miller?" Jake asked as they cleaned the kennels together. "You seem worried about something." Evan deflected the question, but Jake's observation was accurate. The weight of his undisclosed plans was affecting his ability to engage normally with the daily routines that had become so important to everyone involved in the rescue work. He found himself looking at the South Field differently, mentally calculating how much of the development revenue could be allocated to building proper veterinary facilities, expanding kennel space, and establishing endowment funds that would ensure long-term financial sustainability for the animal rescue operations. Sarah arrived for her weekly visit while Evan and Jake were outside exercising the dogs. She parked next to an unfamiliar black sedan that belonged to Robert Westfield, who had come to finalize some details about soil testing and environmental assessments required for the development permit applications. Evan felt his stomach drop as he realized that his carefully maintained secrecy was about to end in the most awkward way possible. "Whose car is that?" Sarah asked as she approached with a kennel containing a new rescue animal. Before Evan could answer, Robert Westfield emerged from the house carrying his briefcase and the survey maps that clearly identified him as someone involved in real estate development rather than animal care. His business attire and professional demeanor contrasted sharply with the farm setting in ways that immediately raised questions about his presence. "Miss Chun, I presume?" Westfield said, extending his hand towards Sarah with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to managing potentially difficult conversations. "Robert Westfield, Westfield Development Corporation. I've been working with Evan on some exciting plans for optimizing the economic potential of this beautiful property." Sarah's expression shifted from polite curiosity to alarm as she processed the implications of Westfield's introduction. Her eyes moved from his business card to the survey maps visible through the kitchen window, and then to Evan's face, where she read confirmation of what she was beginning to suspect. "You're selling the farm," she said, her voice carrying a flatness that Evan had never heard before. "Not the farm," Evan said quickly. "Just the South Field, to fund the animal rescue work." The distinction felt inadequate, even as he spoke it. Jake had moved closer during the conversation, and his expression showed the kind of betrayal that only comes from discovering that someone you trust has been keeping significant secrets. Mrs. Chun, who had just arrived with a basket of fresh vegetables from her garden, stood frozen near her car as she absorbed the tension radiating from the group gathered near the house. "You've been planning this without telling any of us," Sarah continued, her professional composure beginning to crack. "We've been working together to build something important here, and you've been secretly planning to destroy it." "Not destroy it," Evan protested. "Fund it properly. The rescue work is costing more than I can afford, and selling the South Field would provide enough money to do this right instead of struggling to keep up with expenses that increase every week." Westfield cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should leave you folks to discuss this privately. Evan, you have my contact information when you're ready to proceed." His departure left an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch longer than the few seconds it actually lasted. Sarah set down the kennel she had been carrying and crossed her arms, her body language clearly indicating that she expected a more complete explanation than Evan had provided. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. "About 3 weeks," Evan admitted. "Since Luna's emergency vet visit made it clear that I can't continue providing adequate care without better financial resources. And you didn't think we might have other ideas about how to solve that problem?" Jake interjected, his usual respectful tone replaced by obvious hurt. "We're supposed to be partners in this work, but you made a huge decision without even talking to us." Mrs. Chun approached the group slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. What exactly are you planning to do with the money from selling the land? She asked. Evan felt grateful for her practical focus on outcomes rather than process. Build proper veterinary facilities here on the farm. Expand the kennel space so we can help more animals. Set up an endowment fund that would provide ongoing support for animal care expenses. Turn this into a real sanctuary instead of just a temporary solution. And you believe that selling 40 acres of your family's land is the only way to accomplish those goals? Mrs. Chun continued. The question hung in the air like a challenge Evan wasn't certain he could meet. He had researched grants, fundraising, and other potential revenue sources, but none of them had seemed capable of generating the substantial capital needed for the kind of permanent improvements he envisioned. The land sale represented a definitive solution that would eliminate financial uncertainty and provide resources adequate for serious facility development. I've looked at other options, he said. This seems like the most realistic approach to ensuring long-term sustainability. Sarah shook her head slowly. You've looked at other options alone, without consulting the people who are just as invested in this work as you are. That's not how partnerships work, Evan. The accusation stung, because it was accurate. Evan had made the land sale decision independently, treating Sarah, Jake, and Mrs. Chun as assistants in his project, rather than collaborators with valuable perspectives and potential contributions. His desire to handle the financial challenges privately had led him to exclude people who might have developed alternative solutions or at least participated in the decision-making process. I was trying to protect everyone from having to worry about money problems, he said weakly. You were trying to protect yourself from having to admit that you don't have all the answers, Jake replied with a directness that surprised everyone, including himself. The young man's insight was uncomfortably perceptive. Evan realized that his secrecy had been motivated as much by pride as by practical considerations. Acknowledging financial limitations felt like admitting failure to successfully manage the responsibilities he had inherited and chosen to expand. Involving others in finding solutions would have required admitting that his individual efforts were insufficient for the challenges he faced. As the four people stood in the farmyard, surrounded by animals who depended on their continued cooperation. The land survey map visible through the kitchen window seemed to pulse with implications that none of them had fully considered. The decision about selling the South Field had become about much more than real estate or animal rescue funding. It had become a test of whether their informal partnership could survive the stress of conflicting priorities and failed communication. The beautiful afternoon light that had made the farm look like a painting suddenly seemed harsh and unforgiving, exposing truths that comfortable routines had allowed them to avoid confronting. The future of everything they had built together would depend on whether they could find a way forward that honored everyone's contributions and concerns, or whether the weight of financial necessity would fracture relationships that had become as important as the animal rescue work itself. The petition started as a single sheet of paper that Mrs. Chun brought to the farm 3 days after the confrontation about the land sale. She had spent those days making phone calls, visiting neighbors, and having what she called frank conversations with people throughout Cedar Ridge about the value of Evan's animal rescue work and the importance of finding community-based solutions to his financial challenges. 67 signatures, she announced, unfolding the document on Evan's kitchen table. Every person who signed this agrees that what you're doing here matters to our community, and they're willing to support it in practical ways. The list included names that surprised Evan with their breadth and diversity. Harold Briggs had signed it, despite their ongoing tensions over the fence line dispute. Several families who had adopted animals from the rescue operation had added not just their signatures but handwritten notes expressing gratitude for the care their pets had received. Local businesses offered various forms of support, from discounted veterinary services to donations of building materials for facility improvements. Most significantly, the petition included commitments from people Evan barely knew, residents of Cedar Ridge, who had heard about the rescue work through the informal network of communication that characterized small rural communities. Their willingness to support an operation they had learned about secondhand spoke to the broader impact that the animal rescue work was having on the community's sense of identity and purpose. "This is remarkable," Evan said, reading through the detailed offers of assistance that accompanied many of the signatures. "I had no idea so many people even knew about what we're doing here." "You underestimate your impact," Mrs. Chun replied, with the gentle firmness that characterized her approach to most subjects. "When Jake's family talks about how much he's learned working with you, people listen. When Sarah mentions the success rate of animals fostered here compared to other placements, people remember. When Harold Briggs admits that his spiteful gesture turned into something beautiful, people pay attention." The petition represented more than community supported. Represented a network of relationships and resources that Evan had been too focused on his immediate problems to recognize. The signatures included offers of labor for construction projects, professional services donated by local contractors and veterinarians, ongoing financial support through monthly pledges, and various forms of material assistance that could significantly reduce the operational costs of expanding the rescue facilities. Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian who had treated Luna's arthritis, had signed the petition along with an offer to provide routine medical care for rescue animals at cost, eliminating the markup that typically made veterinary services prohibitively expensive for animal welfare organizations. The Cedar Ridge hardware store committed to supplying building materials at wholesale prices for any facility improvements. 3 local contractors offered to donate labor for construction projects during their slower winter months. Most touchingly, several elderly residents had pledged small, monthly donations that they described as investments in the kind of community we want to live in. Their contributions individually were modest, but collectively, they represented ongoing financial support that could cover many of the routine expenses that had been straining Evan's budget. "The community has been watching you," Mrs. Chun continued. "Not in a judgmental way, but with appreciation for someone who stepped up to handle a problem that affects all of us. Animal abandonment and neglect don't just hurt the animals. They hurt the community's sense of decency and compassion. What you've been doing here addresses that hurt." Sarah had spent the same 3 days researching grant opportunities and alternative funding sources that might provide the capital needed for major facility improvements without requiring land sales. Her professional experience with animal welfare organizations had given her insights into funding mechanisms that Evan had been unaware of when he conducted his initial research. There are state and federal grants specifically designed to support rural animal welfare initiatives, she explained during their first conversation since the confrontation. The application processes are complex, but the potential funding amounts could cover most of your facility development costs. The grant opportunities included programs administered by the Department of Agriculture to support diversified rural enterprises, animal welfare foundations that funded sanctuary development, and state environmental agencies that provided grants. FOR projects demonstrating sustainable land use practices. The combined potential funding from multiple sources could total several $100,000, approaching the amount that would be generated by selling the South Field. The catch is that grant funding requires detailed project planning, professional facility design, and demonstrated community support, Sarah continued. It's not quick money, and there's no guarantee of approval, but it would allow you to develop the facilities you want without sacrificing any of your family's land. Jake had spent his time researching successful animal sanctuary operations in other rural areas, trying to identify operational models and funding strategies that might be applicable to Evan's situation. His research had revealed that the most Successful operations typically combine multiple revenue sources rather than depending on single large infusions of capital. "Look at this place in Tennessee," Jake said, showing Evan printed materials from a sanctuary that had started with circumstances similar to their own. "They began with one farmer fostering animals from the county shelter, just like you. Now, they have educational programs that generate revenue, volunteer training workshops that bring people from other counties, and partnerships with veterinary schools that provide both services and funding." The Tennessee sanctuary had developed a sustainable business model that generated sufficient revenue to support its animal welfare mission while providing employment for several community members and educational opportunities for young people interested in animal care careers. Their success had been built gradually over 10 years, but it demonstrated that rural animal sanctuaries could become economically viable while serving broader community purposes. They started a summer camp program for kids interested in animals, Jake continued enthusiastically. "And they offer weekend workshops for people who want to learn about animal training and behavior. Some of their rescued animals work as therapy animals in nursing homes and hospitals. It's not just about housing animals, it's about creating connections between animals and people that benefit everyone." The research suggested possibilities that Evan hadn't considered when he was focusing solely on immediate financial challenges. Instead of viewing the animal rescue work as an expensive commitment that required external funding to sustain, these examples showed how animal welfare operations could evolve into self-supporting enterprises that generated community benefits beyond their primary mission. But the community mobilization also created new pressures that Evan hadn't anticipated. The petition signers weren't simply offering abstract support. They were expressing expectations that the rescue work would continue and expand in ways that served their vision of what Cedar Ridge could become. Their offers of assistance came with implicit obligations to maintain the operation that had inspired their contributions. Robert Westfield called twice during the week following the petition's presentation, asking about Evan's timeline for finalizing the land sale decision. The development company had begun preliminary engineering work based on their assumption that Evan would proceed with the transaction, and delays were creating costs that would eventually need to be absorbed by someone. "I understand that family land decisions are emotionally complex," Westfield said during their second conversation, "but our investors are expecting definitive answers within a reasonable time frame. If you're having second thoughts about the sale, we need to know soon, so we can redirect our planning efforts." The pressure from both directions, community expectations on one side and development company deadlines on the other, created a sense of urgency that made careful consideration more difficult. Evan found himself waking up at night wondering whether he was making decisions based on genuine assessment of alternatives or simply responding to the most recent conversation he had experienced. The legal complications emerged when Evan contacted a lawyer to review the development company's contract terms. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in agricultural law, raised questions about zoning restrictions and environmental regulations that might affect the proposed subdivision development. Cedar Ridge County recently updated its zoning ordinances to limit residential development in agricultural areas, Walsh explained during their consultation. "Your property is currently zoned for agricultural use, and changing that designation requires approval from the County Planning Commission. That process can take 6 months to 2 years, depending on various factors including community input and environmental impact assessments." The revelation that the land sale might face regulatory obstacles added another layer of complexity to Evan's decision-making process. If zoning approval was uncertain or significantly delayed, the development contract might not provide the quick financial solution he'd been counting on to resolve his immediate budget pressures. More troubling was Walsh's observation that vocal community opposition could significantly complicate the zoning change process. The same petition that demonstrated support for Evan's animal rescue work could be mobilized to oppose residential development of agricultural land, potentially blocking the land sale even if Evan decided to proceed with it. Agricultural land preservation has become a significant political issue in this county, Walsh continued. The Planning Commission has been increasingly reluctant to approve conversions that reduce the amount of land available for farming. Your neighbors' support for your rescue work might translate into opposition to any development that would eliminate 40 acres of productive farmland. As Evans sat in his truck outside the lawyer's office, reviewing the copies of zoning regulations and development approval procedures that Walsh had provided, he realized that his assumed solution to the financial challenges might be far more complicated and uncertain than he had understood. The community support that Mrs. Chun's petition had demonstrated could prove to be a double-edged sword, encouraging his animal welfare work while simultaneously blocking the land sale that he had planned to fund that work. The path forward was becoming less clear rather than more defined, despite the additional information and community input he had gathered. With less than a week remaining before Westfield Development's deadline for a final decision, Evan faced the prospect of choosing between alternatives that all carried significant risks and uncertain outcomes. The weight of those decisions extended beyond his own future to affect the animals in his care, the people who had committed to supporting his work, and the community's vision of what their rural area could become. The Cedar Ridge Community Center hadn't hosted a gathering this large since the annual Harvest Festival 3 years earlier. By 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, nearly every folding chair in the building was occupied, and people continued to arrive carrying lawn chairs and cushions to accommodate the overflow crowd. The agenda posted by the front door was simple: community discussion, supporting local animal welfare initiatives, but everyone understood that they were actually there to decide the future of Evan Miller's rescue operation and, by extension, the fate of 40 acres of farmland that had been in his family for 3 generations. Mayor Patricia Hendricks called the meeting to order with the wooden gavel that had been used for community meetings since the 1940s. She was a practical woman in her 60s who had grown up on a farm herself and understood both the economic pressures facing rural families and the importance of preserving agricultural character in rapidly changing communities. We're here tonight because one of our neighbors is facing a decision that affects all of us, she began, her voice carrying easily through the room without amplification. Evan Miller has been providing a valuable service to our community through his animal rescue work, but that service comes with financial costs that he's been shouldering alone. We need to decide whether we want to support that work as a community or watch it end because individual resources aren't sufficient to sustain it. Evan sat in the front row between Sarah and Mrs. Chun, acutely aware that every person in the room was there because of decisions he had made and problems he hadn't been able to solve independently. Jake sat directly behind him with his parents, who had driven in from the outskirts of town to show support for their son's involvement in the rescue work. Harold Briggs occupied a seat near the back of the room, his presence a reminder of how the entire situation had begun with his vindictive gesture. 2 months earlier, Robert Westfield had been invited to present the development proposal, and he stood at the front of the room with professional materials that outlined the economic benefits of converting the Miller Farm South Field into residential housing. His presentation was polished and persuasive, emphasizing job creation during construction, increased property tax revenue for the county, and the provision of quality housing options for families who wanted to live in Cedar Ridge but currently had few choices available. The Miller's Ridge development would bring 28 new families to this community, Westfield explained, clicking through aerial photographs and architectural renderings projected on a screen borrowed from the high school. These wouldn't be temporary residents or vacation homes. These would be permanent residents who would shop at local businesses, attend local schools, and contribute to the tax base that funds community services. The financial figures were impressive. Construction activity would provide employment for local contractors and suppliers for approximately 18 months. The completed homes would generate annual property tax revenues of nearly $200,000, funding improvements to roads, schools, and other community infrastructure that everyone would benefit from. Most importantly, Westfield continued. This development would provide Mr. Miller with the financial resources he needs to expand his animal rescue operation into a permanent, professionally equipped facility that could serve the entire region rather than just Cedar Ridge County. Several audience members asked detailed questions about traffic impact, utility requirements, and environmental considerations. Westfield's responses demonstrated that his company had conducted thorough planning designed to minimize negative impacts while maximizing community benefits. The development proposal was professionally sound and financially attractive in ways that were difficult to dismiss. When Westfield finished his presentation, Mayor Hendricks invited community members to share their perspectives on both the development proposal and alternative approaches to supporting Evan's animal rescue work. The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of opinions within a community that valued both agricultural preservation and practical problem solving. Tom Bradley, who owned a construction company that had been struggling with reduced work opportunities, spoke in favor of the development. "We need economic activity in this area," he said. "Young people are leaving because there aren't enough job opportunities, and businesses are closing because there aren't enough customers." 28. New families would make a real difference in keeping this community viable. His comments were followed by enthusiastic support from several other business owners who saw residential development as essential for maintaining economic vitality in a rural area that was losing population and commerce to larger towns with more diverse economies than. But Mary Fitzgerald, whose family had farmed in Cedar Ridge for 4 generations, offered a different perspective. Once agricultural land is converted to residential use, it's gone forever, she said. "We've already lost thousands of acres in this county to development, and every acre we lose makes it harder for the remaining farms to operate successfully. There has to be a way to support Evan's animal work without sacrificing more farmland." Her position was echoed by several younger farmers who argued that preserving agricultural land was essential for maintaining the rural character that made Cedar Ridge attractive to both current residents and potential newcomers. They suggested that residential development might actually undermine the community's long-term appeal by eliminating the agricultural landscapes that defined its identity. Dr. Martinez spoke as both a veterinarian and a longtime resident who had witnessed the community's evolution over 2 decades. "What Evan has accomplished with limited resources demonstrates the potential for animal welfare work to become a defining characteristic of our community," he said. "Instead of choosing between development and animal rescue, we should be asking how we can make animal welfare a permanent part of Cedar Ridge's identity in ways that attract people and resources rather than requiring us to sacrifice land." His suggestion sparked interest from audience members who hadn't considered the possibility that animal welfare work could become an economic asset rather than simply an expense. Several people mentioned successful agritourism operations in neighboring counties that generated revenue while preserving agricultural land use and rural character. Sarah stood to address the gathering with the professional authority that came from her experience managing animal welfare programs throughout the region. "The need for animal rescue services is only going to increase as rural areas continue to change," she said. "We can either address that need reactively, crisis by crisis, or we can develop sustainable systems that serve animals and communities proactively. What Evan has started here could become a model for other rural areas facing similar challenges." She outlined the potential for grant funding, volunteer programs, and educational initiatives that could make the rescue operation financially self-sustaining while providing community benefits that extended beyond animal welfare. Her vision encompassed training programs for young people interested in animal care careers, partnerships with veterinary schools that would bring students and resources to the area, and therapeutic animal programs that could serve elderly residents and others with special needs. As the evening progressed, the discussion evolved from a debate about land use to a broader conversation about what kind of community Cedar Ridge wanted to become and how various choices would affect that vision. The development proposal represented immediate economic benefits and practical solutions to current problems. The alternative approaches suggested longer-term investments in community identity and sustainable systems that might provide greater benefits over time, but required more complex coordination and uncertain outcomes. Mayor Hendricks had planned to conclude the meeting by 9 o'clock, but the engaged discussion continued well past that time as community members worked through the implications of various choices and explored possibilities that hadn't been fully considered before the gathering. The wooden gavel remained unused as the formal meeting evolved into the kind of organic community conversation that often produced the most meaningful decisions. Harold Briggs had been sitting quietly in the back of the community center for nearly 2 hours, listening to his neighbors debate the future of an animal rescue operation that had begun with his attempt to punish Evan Miller for a fence line dispute that now seemed petty and insignificant. As the discussion continued past 9 o'clock, he found himself thinking about the pregnant golden retriever he had dumped on Evan's property 2 months earlier, and how that vindictive gesture had created something beautiful that the entire community was now rallying to support. When Mayor Hendricks asked if anyone else wanted to speak before they moved toward making decisions, Harold stood up with the slow deliberation of a man who had spent considerable time preparing for a moment he wasn't certain he would have the courage to face. "I need to say something," he announced, his voice carrying across the room with surprising strength. "Most of you know that I'm the reason we're all here tonight." The community center fell silent as Harold walked from the back of the room toward the front, his boots echoing on the wooden floor with each measured step. Evan turned to watch him approach, uncertain whether this development would help or complicate an already complex situation. 2 months ago, I was angry about a property dispute with Evan," Harold continued, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of making this public admission. "I thought I could teach him a lesson by dumping a pregnant dog on his property, figuring he'd either get rid of her quick or be stuck with a problem he couldn't handle." He paused at the front of the room, looking out at neighbors and friends who had known him for decades but had never heard him acknowledge a mistake this publicly. "I was wrong about Evan, and I was wrong about what that dog would mean to him and to this community. Instead of creating a problem, I accidentally gave him an opportunity to show us something about compassion and responsibility that we all needed to see." Harold's next words came with obvious effort, but his voice remained clear and determined. "What Evan has built with that animal rescue operation makes Cedar Ridge a better place. It makes all of us better people. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let my stupidity be the reason he has to choose between his family's land and continuing that work." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded check, which he placed on the table in front of Mayor Hendricks. "That's $50,000, my contribution to keeping the rescue operation going and making sure Evan doesn't have to sell his land to developers." The gesture created a moment of stunned silence that was broken by scattered applause that quickly grew until most of the room was clapping enthusiastically. Harold raised his hand to quiet the response, indicating that he had more to say. "But money isn't the only thing this operation needs," he continued. "It needs community support, and it needs people who understand that taking care of animals who can't take care of themselves is part of what makes a community worth living in. I'm offering 20 acres of my own land adjacent to Evan's property for expansion of the rescue facilities. No cost, no restrictions. just a chance to do something right after doing something wrong. The magnitude of Harold's offer created another wave of surprise conversation throughout the room. 20 acres of prime farmland, combined with his financial contribution, represented resources that could transform Evan's modest rescue operation into a regional facility, capable of serving multiple counties, while remaining on agricultural land that would be preserved rather than developed. Sarah stood immediately to address the implications of Harold's offer. 20 additional acres would allow us to create specialized facilities for different types of animals, she said, her voice rising with excitement as she processed the possibilities. We could have separate areas for dogs, cats, farm animals, and wildlife rehabilitation. We could build proper veterinary facilities, quarantine areas, and adoption centers that would serve the entire region. Dr. Martinez quickly added his perspective as someone who understood the infrastructure requirements for serious animal welfare operations. With that much space and adequate funding, we could create a teaching facility that would attract veterinary students and provide ongoing professional development for animal care workers throughout the state. The educational components alone could generate significant revenue while serving the rescue mission. Jake Morrison had been listening to the discussion with growing excitement about possibilities he hadn't imagined when he first started helping Evan with daily animal care. We could have summer programs for kids who want to learn about animals, he said, his enthusiasm evident despite his nervousness about speaking to such a large group. And training programs for people who want to work in animal care. It could be like a school that also saves animals. The momentum created by Harold's unexpected generosity was building towards something much larger than anyone had envisioned. When the meeting began, Mrs. Chun stood to add her perspective on the practical coordination that would be required to manage such an expanded operation. This kind of facility would need professional management and significant volunteer coordination, she said. But it would also create employment opportunities for people in our community who care about animal welfare. Instead of young people leaving Cedar Ridge because there aren't career opportunities here, some of them could stay and build meaningful work around something that serves a genuine need. Robert Westfield had been listening to the evolving discussion with the professional awareness of someone whose business proposal was being superseded by alternative developments. When Mayor Hendricks asked if he wanted to respond to the community's apparent preference for supporting the rescue operation rather than approving residential development, he stood with good grace to acknowledge the changed circumstances. Westfield, development respects community decisions about land use, he said diplomatically. Mr. Miller's South Field would have made an excellent residential development. But it sounds like this community has identified a better use for agricultural land that serves your specific needs and values. We'll be happy to work with other landowners who are interested in residential development opportunities that have stronger community support. His gracious withdrawal from the land purchase negotiations removed the time pressure that had been forcing Evan toward a premature decision about selling family land to fund rescue operations. The combination of Harold's financial contribution, land donation, and emerging community support was creating alternatives that could achieve Evan's goals without requiring him to sacrifice his agricultural heritage. Mayor Hendricks recognized that the meeting had evolved beyond discussion toward actual decision-making that would require follow-up coordination among multiple parties. It sounds like we have the foundation for a plan that could work for everyone, she said. But turning these ideas into reality will require careful planning and ongoing commitment from many people. She proposed forming a steering committee that would work with Ed and Sarah and Harold to develop detailed plans for expanding the rescue operation using Harold's land donation and financial contribution as starting resources. The committee would also pursue grant funding opportunities that Sarah had identified and coordinate volunteer efforts that could provide ongoing support for the expanded operation. We'll need to file paperwork to establish this as a formal nonprofit organization, Mayor Hendricks continued, and we'll need to develop operational plans that ensure financial sustainability and professional management. This is a significant undertaking that will require the same kind of long-term commitment that farming requires. The wooden gavel finally came down at nearly 10:30 that evening, not to end debate, but to formalize the community's commitment to supporting an expanded animal rescue operation that would preserve agricultural land while serving regional needs for animal welfare services. The meeting that had begun as a discussion about whether to support Evan's modest rescue work had evolved into a decision to create something much more ambitious and permanent. 6 months after that pivotal community meeting, Evan stood at the edge of what had once been Harold's unused pasture and was now the construction site for the Cedar Ridge Animal Sanctuary's main facility building. The morning air carried the sounds of hammers and power tools as volunteers worked alongside professional contractors to frame walls that would house veterinary examination rooms, quarantine facilities, and administrative offices for what had become the region's most ambitious animal welfare project. The memorial plaque mounted on a stone cairn near the construction site bore a simple inscription, in memory of Thomas and Eleanor Miller, whose legacy of compassion and stewardship lives on through Maples Haven Animal Sanctuary. Evan had chosen the location carefully, positioning the memorial where it would be visible from both the new facility and the farmhouse, where 3 generations of his family had lived and worked the land that remained agricultural while serving a broader purpose than anyone had originally imagined. Maple emerged from the barn with her characteristic dignity, now a confident mother whose 5 puppies had grown into healthy young dogs, who had each found loving homes throughout the region. She had become the unofficial mascot of the sanctuary, greeting visitors with the calm assurance of an animal who understood her important role in the operation that bore her name. Her presence at adoption events and educational programs provided living proof that animals written off as problems could become sources of joy and inspiration when given proper care and opportunity. The transformation of both properties had been remarkable to witness. Harold's 20-acre donation had been developed into specialized facilities that could accommodate different types of animals with varying needs and temperaments. The dog areas featured both indoor kennels and outdoor exercise runs, with separate sections for animals requiring medical treatment, behavioral rehabilitation, or simple temporary housing while awaiting adoption. Cat facilities included both individual and group housing options, with dedicated spaces for pregnant mothers and young kittens who needed quiet environments to thrive. Most impressively, the sanctuary had added farm animal rescue capabilities that served a need no one had fully recognized until the facilities became available. Horses, goats, pigs, and cattle abandoned by owners who could no longer care for them now had a place to receive proper treatment while arrangements were made for permanent placement with appropriate caretakers. The farm animal program had quickly become one of the sanctuary's most visible success stories, attracting positive attention from agricultural organizations and animal welfare groups throughout the state. The educational components that Jake had envisioned during that community meeting had exceeded everyone's expectations for impact and sustainability. The summer youth program attracted participants from 6 counties, providing intensive training in animal care while generating revenue that helped support the sanctuary's operations. Weekend workshops for adults interested in animal training, behavior, and healthcare drew participants from urban areas who were eager to learn skills that rural communities often took for granted. Most significantly, the partnership with the State University's veterinary school had created a year-round internship program that brought students to Cedar Ridge for hands-on experience while providing professional veterinary services at reduced costs. The arrangement benefited everyone involved. Students gained practical experience working with a diverse population of animals. The sanctuary received high-quality medical care for its residents, and the community gained access to veterinary expertise that might otherwise have been unavailable in a rural area. Jake Morrison had become the sanctuary's first full-time employee, working as assistant manager while completing his high school education through a combination of traditional classes and hands-on learning experiences that would prepare him for veterinary or animal management studies at the university level. His transformation from part-time volunteer to professional animal care specialist demonstrated the kind of career opportunities that the sanctuary was creating for young people who might otherwise have needed to leave Cedar Ridge to find meaningful work. The new arrivals are in quarantine building 2, Jake reported as he approached Evan near the memorial cairn. Sarah's doing initial health assessments, and they should be ready for general population housing by early next week if everything checks out. The new arrivals were 3 dogs and 2 cats rescued from an overcrowded situation in a neighboring county, where local authorities had been overwhelmed by the scope of animal neglect they discovered. Cases like this had become routine for the sanctuary, which now served as a regional resource for animal control agencies and law enforcement organizations dealing with situations beyond their capacity to handle locally. Sarah Chun had been appointed as the sanctuary's executive director, a position that utilized her professional expertise while allowing her to expand animal welfare services throughout the region in ways that her previous county position had never permitted. Under her leadership, the sanctuary had developed protocols and procedures that were being studied by similar organizations nationwide as models for effective rural animal welfare operations. The university students want to present their research project at next month's board meeting, Sarah announced as she joined Evan and Jake near the construction site. They've been tracking health outcomes and adoption success rates, and their preliminary findings suggest that our approach to rehabilitation and placement is significantly more successful than traditional shelter models. The research validation was gratifying, but Evan found even greater satisfaction in the daily evidence that the sanctuary was achieving its core mission of providing second chances to animals who might otherwise have been euthanized due to overcrowding or lack of resources. The adoption rates approached 90% for healthy animals, and even animals with medical or behavioral challenges found appropriate placements through the sanctuary's network of specialized foster families and partner organizations. Mrs. Chun arrived for her weekly volunteer shift, carrying a basket of vegetables from her garden and a thermos of coffee that had become legendary among the sanctuary's regular volunteers. At 79, she remained one of the most energetic and effective workers, coordinating volunteer schedules with the efficiency that had made her successful in managing various community organizations throughout her long residence in Cedar Ridge. 47 volunteers scheduled for this week, she reported, consulting the detailed charts that kept track of who was responsible for which tasks and when, including 8 new people who completed orientation last weekend. We're going to need to start a second orientation session each month if interest continues growing at this rate. The volunteer program had become one of the sanctuary's greatest assets, providing essential labor while creating meaningful connections between community members and the animals they served. Regular volunteers developed expertise in specific areas, some specialized in dog training, others focused on cat socialization, and still others became skilled at caring for farm animals or providing administrative support for adoption processes. Harold Briggs appeared around the corner of the main building, leading a tour group that included visitors from 3 other counties who were considering similar animal welfare initiatives in their own communities. His transformation from the bitter neighbor who had dumped a pregnant dog as punishment to the sanctuary's most enthusiastic advocate and tour guide represented one of the most remarkable personal changes that the project had inspired. This started with me making a stupid, mean-spirited decision, Harold was explaining to the tour group as they approached. But sometimes the worst mistakes can lead to the best outcomes if good people are willing to turn problems into opportunities. What you're seeing here is what happens when a community decides to support compassion instead of just talking about it. Harold's role as the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador had proven invaluable for attracting support from other communities and organizations interested in replicating the Cedar Ridge model. His willingness to acknowledge his role in starting the chain of events, combined with his obvious pride in what the sanctuary had accomplished, created a powerful narrative about redemption and community transformation that resonated with diverse audiences. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the construction site. As the day's work wound down and evening feeding routines began in the established animal housing areas, Evan walked a familiar path between buildings, checking on animals and volunteers with the same attention to detail that his father had brought to daily farm operations. The work was different now, but the underlying commitment to stewardship and care remained unchanged. In the original barn where Maple had given birth to 5 puppies during a spring storm, a new pregnant dog named Hope was creating a nest in the same stall where everything had begun. Sarah had brought her to the sanctuary the previous week after animal control officers found her abandoned in a foreclosed house where she had been surviving on scraps and rainwater. Like Maple before her, Hope had been written off as a problem, to be disposed of quickly. But the sanctuary offered her the same chance for a new beginning that had transformed so many lives over the past months.